Hello, this is Angela Parra-Disney, continuing the reading of Tim Tate's book, Children for the Devil, to get a proper grip on a scholarly history of satanic abuse and ritual crime. There are two other books which make a trifecta, but this one is difficult to get hold of and very valuable. So we'll continue with chapter 7. There we go. So chapter 7, Hear No Evil. And the quote is, I want to kill off once and for all stories that children in Nottingham have been victims of satanic abuse, quote unquote. Quoted by Dan Crompton, Chief Constable, Nottingham, October 1990. Just worth noting that Nottingham has featured very heavily in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse that's going on in the UK at the moment. And the abuse, sadly, and the cover-ups go back decades in Nottingham. So here we go, back on the text. In February 1989, the Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box in the House of Commons and lavished praise on the men and women of Nottinghamshire County Council's Social Services Department. The members of Team 4, the specialist unit set up within the Children's Division to handle Britain's biggest single case of multiple child sexual abuse, were singled out for Margaret Thatcher's unstinting admiration when 10 adult offenders were jailed. Okay. Within a year, the leader of that team, Judith Dawson, was in an impossible position. Nominally, Nottinghamshire County Council's child abuse consultant, the most senior social worker in the Children's Division, she found herself excluded from all abuse case conferences and severely criticised in an internal report she was not allowed to see, which was widely leaked to the press. At the same time, Nottingham detectives ensured that Dawson and some of her Team 4 colleagues were publicly denounced, undermined, and targeted for police surveillance of their private lives. Their professionalism and abilities were under constant attack from men and women who were meant to be their colleagues inside Nottingham CID. It was a dirty, dishonest, and underhand campaign that would lead to Dawson's isolation throughout 1990. It also ensured that a number of children remained trapped in the evil misery of ritual abuse. This is so familiar. What makes the Nottingham case all the more important is its remarkable similarity to a case that began 4 years earlier and 3,000 miles away. Manhattan Beach is the closest that Los Angeles comes to the idea of a village. Sociologists and market research companies list it as an upper quintile community, which is to say that those who live there are generally upper to middle class and in the discreetly advertising-friendly high-income bracket. It is a small beachside commuter resort, accessible now only to those able to afford upwards of $350,000. This was 1991 for a 2-bedroom bungalow. By 1983, most of the incomers were young professional couples, perhaps with children, but desperately needing 2 salaries to make ends meet. As a result, the demand for full-time daycare and preschool places was higher even than the national American average of 1 child in 10. Oh no. As a result, the demand for full-time daycare and preschool places was higher even than the national American average of 1 child in 10. The Preschool owned and operated by Virginia McMartin was, to those who could afford its fees, probably the most desirable nursery for their toddlers. In the 20 years since she had opened for business, Virginia McMartin had been awarded every single civic service medal or certificate the city had to honor its citizens. Virginia herself was a veritable matriarch. In her mid-70s and still running the school as a family business. Her daughter Peggy managed the day-to-day business, and her grandson Raymond Bucky was one of the teachers. The school buildings were spotlessly clean, no small accolade given the condition of many American daycare centers. State child welfare inspectors routinely pronounced it well-staffed and efficiently run, and every morning the young Americans who were brought to its doors were required to salute the stars and stripes as it was run up a flagpole. The McMartin preschool was an institution. Perhaps it was this that helped parents ignore some of the more curious school rules. They were not allowed to visit the school, other than to collect their offspring at the end of the day, for the first 6 weeks after enrollment. From those with an inconvenient need to break this rule, Virginia McMartin required advance notice and would on no account interrupt the children's after-lunch sleep time. Added to this were the regular curiosities of daycare life the world over. Children often came home without underwear or sporting different clothes from those they had started the day in. Such incidents are routine in preschools as toddlers wet their own clothes playing or by accident and are redressed in a raggle-taggle collection of assorted sweaters and jeans kept for such moments. What made the McMartin incidents different was that the clothing appeared to belong to other children who attended the school on the same day. The kids appeared to swap. All of these curiosities passed by their parents, who were, after all, extremely busy adults. Similarly, uncontrollable sobbing by the toddlers as they were forced inside the school buildings was taken as the normal reluctance of young children to leave their parents. By autumn 1983, a few mothers were beginning to feel vaguely uncomfortable about the behavior of Raymond Bucky around the children. There was nothing they could quite pin down other than a slight unease over his very physical contact with their children. But when they mentioned this to Peggy McMartin, she dismissed their concerns outright. Ray was her son, and there was nothing amiss. In fact, Ray Bucky was a strange choice for a preschool teacher. He was 26 years old, a health food and weightlifting fanatic, with no qualifications other than an abortive college career. But since his mother ran the school and his grandmother owned it, the explanation perhaps lay in his family ties. In August 1983, a 2-year-old boy came home from McMartin with evidence of blood on his anus. His mother, Judy Johnson, promptly took him to the Manhattan Beach Police Department. She was advised to have her son undergo a formal medical examination and set off for the local hospital. Doctors there redirected her to the emergency treatment unit at UCLA. Whatever would happen later to Judy Johnson, one thing is quite clear. In 1983, she was of sound mind and had not been involved in any form of sexual abuse case, let alone one involving rituals, ever before. So it came as a shock when UCLA doctors gently told her that her son had been sodomized. American law enforcement and prosecution demarcation can be confusing to the outsider. Not only is there a nationwide federal police force whose cases are routinely prosecuted by federal attorneys, but beneath them, the localized structure subdivides along somewhat arbitrary lines. It was the luck of the draw that when Judy Johnson went to report the apparent sexual abuse of her son, she did so in Manhattan Beach Police Department. Although technically a suburb of Los Angeles and a relatively small community, Manhattan Beach is formally incorporated under state law as a city in its own right. This means that although the prosecution of crimes detected within its boundaries is undertaken by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the actual investigation is carried out by Manhattan Beach PD rather than by Los Angeles detectives. By 1983, LAPD could boast one of the finest and most experienced teams of child abuse investigators anywhere in the world. It had been testimony from Los Angeles detectives in the Senate and congressional hearings in the late 1970s, which had first alerted Americans to the existence of widespread pedophilia and child pornography. The city had been among the first to set up specialist investigation divisions to cover pedophilia activity, and since 1975, its sexually exploited child unit had been amongst the most successful and influential in policing pedophilia. According to US Federal Assistant Attorney Joyce Carlin, now a veteran prosecutor of child abusers and pornographers, quote, "Had it not been for the guys from LAPD, I don't think America would be as aware of the problems as we are. Certainly when I started here, it was the investigators from the Sexually Exploited Child Unit who lobbied and educated me into action." From the outset, LAPD's specialist investigators had been aware of bizarre and violent forms of child sexual abuse. Sergeant Lloyd Martin of the Sexually Exploited Child Unit was able to present to the Senate hearings details of the discovery in 1975 of the bodies of 20 young boys. They had been found sodomized, mutilated, shot in the back of the head, and stuffed into green plastic bin sacks along the roadsides of 4 Southern California counties. This background knowledge, coupled with a strong intelligence division and 8 years solid investigative experience, would have been invaluable to the McMartin case. Unfortunately, it was never deployed. The Manhattan Beach Police Department did not ask for help. Crime in the attractive and well-heeled community tended to fall into one of 3 categories: auto theft, drug abuse, and the occasional illegal immigrant from Mexico. In 1983, Manhattan Beach could boast around a dozen active, if somewhat relaxed, detectives on the city payroll. For good or ill, it was they who began investigating the sexual assault of Judy Johnson's little boy. Very quickly, he identified his abuser as, quote, Mr. Ray. The detectives were not entirely ignorant of sexual abuse cases. They knew that if one child at the school had been abused, apparently by his teacher, Ray Buckey, there were quite likely to be other victims in the past, present, and future. Harry Kuhlmeier, chief of police, decided that his men had to act, and act quickly. But there were more than 100 children enrolled at the McMartin preschool in August 1983. It would be logistically impossible for his small pool of officers either to visit or telephone each family individually. To Kuhlmeier, the best solution was to send out a mimeographed letter asking parents to contact the police department if they had any suspicion that their child might have been abused. The letter ended somewhat lamely by asking the families to keep the investigation a secret. Never perhaps in the history of modern child abuse inquiries has there been a more inept start in a police investigation. The letter itself was, in effect, a leading question, an open invitation to parents to cross-examine their children. That mass mailing, Kuhlmeier admitted later, may not have been the best idea in the world. But we wanted to get the news out and we didn't have the resources to go and knock on everybody's door, quote. The result was chaos. Within 48 hours, there were few families in the 2 Mile Square community who did not know about the letter and the fact that Ray Buckey was chief suspect. Inevitably, that included Ray Buckey himself, Virginia and Peggy McMartin, and the rest of the preschool staff. Under growing public pressure, Kuhlmeier made his second serious error of judgment within 2 days. He obtained a warrant for the arrest of Ray Buckey. A police search of his house the following day produced no supporting evidence whatsoever. Under the complicated American justice system, investigation by local police departments like Manhattan Beach are controlled to some extent by the county district attorney's office. The Los Angeles County DA's department had more than 600 lawyers on its staff, at the time the largest comparable team anywhere in the world. One of the prosecuting attorneys was Gene Matusinka, an experienced lawyer who had worked on child sexual abuse cases for several years. Matusinka saw quickly that without corroborative evidence, there was no chance of making charges against Bucky Stick on the testimony of one 2-year-old boy. The charges were dropped within days of the arrest, but the file remained open. Parents who had received the original letter asking if their children could have been abused at McMartin inevitably began asking their youngsters if Mr. Ray had done anything to them. Many said no and seemed uneasy or reluctant to talk any further, but a few said yes and were taken individually to Manhattan Beach PD. Very quickly, the untrained and understaffed detective division was in over its head. Cool Mayor had assigned just 2 officers to question the children. Neither appeared to have any skill or understanding of the particular problems of child sexual abuse. Although nominally overseeing the investigation, Matusinka could not interfere with the operational side of the inquiry. So although she doubted the ability of the local detectives and suggested to Cool Mayor that he call in outside help, she could do no more than that. Frustrated and uneasy when he declined to do so. I have to ask if the local PD was involved. The outside help was no more than 15 minutes up the freeway. Cool Mayor could have called in LAPD's 9 experienced investigators based in the sexually exploited child unit. Equally, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had, quite literally, thousands of deputies available to help, including some with lengthy experience of child abuse inquiries. Although Manhattan Beach detectives phoned the sexually exploited child unit for advice early on, brackets, advice that LAPD insists was never utilized, it took Cool Mayor until October 1984 to swallow his pride and call in the Sheriff's Department. By then, the case was severely damaged. The local detectives warned parents who brought their children to the department not to discuss the case, to keep their children apart, and even avoid contact with one another. At first, they tried, but Manhattan Beach is such a small community, its houses so close together, and the children all much of the same age, that this proved ultimately impossible. Matusinka, meanwhile, had decided not to rely solely on the efforts of the local police. She decided to call in an expert therapist to assess the children's disclosures. Ken McFarlane had recently moved to Los Angeles for a holiday come sabbatical. Until spring 1983, she had worked, Key McFarlane, I beg your pardon. Until spring 1983, Key had worked as a counselor in Washington, D.C., at the federal government agency, the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. It was during other court cases where she had testified as an expert witness that Matusinka had met and been impressed by her. McFarlane had been made redundant after the Reagan administration cut federal funds to the center and a number of other welfare bodies. She had come to California to complete an academic textbook and, if she found the time, to study for a PhD in social work. She had not planned on working as a counselor in Los Angeles and had not applied for the requisite license. She had, though, agreed to be a consultant to a child welfare charity in the city, the Children's Institute International. It was one of those curious twists of irony that this happened to be Nancy Reagan's personal favorite charity. When Matusinka called her and asked her if she would see a couple of kids from the McMartin preschool, McFarlane agreed reluctantly. Although technically unlicensed, the certificate held by the Children's Institute would just about cover the work. Parents were only too keen to follow Matusynka's suggestion that they contact McFarlane. There was a desperate shortage of suitable therapists for the ever-growing number of presenting victims. Some families discovered that they faced waiting lists several months long just to get on the books, and then at a distance of 100 miles and a cost of up to $100 a session. The real problems began when Matusynka and McFarlane began to blur the roles of therapist and investigator. Without a doubt, Manhattan Beach Police Department was failing to handle the case properly. Parents told McFarlane when they called, "We don't like what the cops are doing with our kids. Will you talk to them for us?" Matusynka appears to have shared that view. She began feeding McFarlane with information from the investigation in the hope that the therapist come up with the usable children's testimony, pinpointing their abuser. In the first dozen or so interviews, this quote, "I never asked about any of the women members of staff. The prosecutors told me there was this guy they suspected and could I find out. So I only asked about him." This betrayed a surprising naivete on McFarlane's part. She knew from previous daycare cases of multiple abuse victims that contamination of evidence was a major problem. With this in mind, she recommended that the McMartin victims be kept away from group therapy, where their stories might cross-fertilize each one another. Quote, "We kept all the McMartin witnesses out of group therapy to the detriment of some of those kids. In the Jordan, Minnesota daycare abuse case, one of the things they hung on the district attorney was the fact that they were housed in the same motel, never mind sitting around in a room talking about who touched their peepees. And yet, without a doubt, if there is one thing we have learned in the history of this field, it's that group therapy is one of the most healing, confirming processes that can happen to children. If you can't do another thing for them, that is the treatment of choice. And so we are up against these terrible dilemmas around what you should do with a kid if he may end up being a witness." Despite this sensible caution, McFarlane allowed herself to become part of the prosecution team, rather than keeping her role as a therapist clearly paramount. But if the identifications of Mr. Ray were potentially contaminated by the end of 1983, McFarlane's interviews with the children, most of whom displayed medical symptoms of abuse, were pointing to a conclusion that Bucky was not the only alleged abuser. The children claimed that some of the abuse had taken place inside the classrooms, and McFarlane, not unnaturally, wondered how this could have taken place without the other teachers seeing or at least hearing it. Quote, "I got to thinking it would have been pretty hard not to know this stuff was happening. And I started saying things like, 'Well, where was Miss Peggy?' And they'd say, 'Oh, she was right there.'" For the first time, and apparently spontaneously, the children were clearly identifying a number of adult abusers. Manhattan Beach Police did not like the interference in their investigation, but agreed to funnel their queries through Key McFarlane. Not that the therapists, now assisted by a small army of trained volunteer social workers, relished this semi-official new role. Quote, "The boundaries got very blurred. The police brought me mugshots and photographs, and we showed those to the children. That was not something the Children's Institute had ever done before, and I don't think it was a good idea." It wasn't. It quickly became apparent to McFarlane that the technique was far from reliable. Quote, "I came to this real quick realization that kids are terrible at that kind of thing. They'll say, 'Oh, there's Uncle Bill,' and of course it isn't Uncle Bill. They were just picking out people who looked scary to them. I felt very uncomfortable with it. We never should have done it." The problem facing Matusynka was simple, if insoluble. McFarlane was a good therapist, but untrained as an investigator. The police, by contrast, were, theoretically, professional detectives, but at a loss when it came to interviewing victims of child sexual abuse. Nonetheless, in spring 1984, the District Attorney's Office sanctioned new charges against Ray Buckey and ordered the arrest of his mother, sister, grandmother, and 3 other women teachers for good measure. The criminal complaint sheet listed 208 counts of alleged abuse of 41 children at the preschool. Simultaneously, the police announced that they had another 36 suspects in the frame, apparently from other daycare centres linked to McMartin, with a further 1,200 suspected child victims. The case was rapidly getting out of hand. Not only were ever greater numbers of children being hustled through the doors of the Children's Institute to see Kee McFarlane and her team, not only were many of these much older children who had not attended the preschool for several years, not only were the questions by now recorded on videotape frequently leading, but the allegations themselves were growing ever more bizarre. Julia McGawley was 2.5 years old when she began attending McMartin Preschool 2 mornings a week. Her mother, Jackie, had booked the little girl in for Monday and Wednesday sessions just after Ray Buckey had been arrested the first time around. Quote, I knew vaguely that there were some sort of allegations floating around, but I didn't really know any of the parents very well at that stage. I was kind of new to town. So I went and asked Peggy McMartin about the troubles, and she told me it was nothing to worry about. There was no truth in the stories, and anyway, Ray was prevented by court order from going anywhere near the school. I suppose I was satisfied by this, and I began taking Julia there, as agreed. After a time, she really began to play up on a Monday morning. She made herself so ill at the thought of going to school that I had to keep her at home. But of course, she would make up that lost time by going on Friday morning instead. Her behavior did change then. She began to have nightmares, she was often withdrawn, and she really didn't seem well. Eventually, 5 months after Julia started at McMartin, and just before the DA's office ordered the rearrest of Ray Buckey and the charging of his mother, sister, grandmother, and fellow teachers, Jackie took her daughter to the doctor. They examined her and found that she had a large number of vaginal tears and scratches. The conclusion they drew was that she had been sexually abused. Julia did not want to talk to the police when her mother took her to the department, nor did she show much inclination to disclose to Kee McFarlane what had happened. It was left to Jackie to work alone with her daughter, and work was needed. The medical examination had unlocked the floodgates of Julia's memories. The little girl was severely traumatized. Quote, sometimes she would talk, other times she would just pull into herself. She used to cry sometimes for 3 days on end. She just lay there crying and shaking. Maybe around dawn she would fall asleep. At first she told me about sexual abuse. Then she began telling me about what seemed to be rituals. One night we were watching TV, and although I had the sound turned right off, I saw that it was showing a new item about Ray Buckey and the others being arrested. It showed a picture of him, and I asked Julia if she knew him. She said, oh yeah, that's Mr. Ray. Now, he wasn't supposed to have been at the preschool when Julia was there, so how could she have known him? She told me that he had abused her in her vagina and that there had been video films and photographs taken of it happening. We had a video camera at the time, so she knew what one looked like. What Julia McGawley was telling her mother, dozens of other youngsters were revealing to Kee McFarlane. The social workers were getting more referrals than they could handle. McFarlane appealed to California's Attorney General, John Vanderkamp, to increase the strength of what had now become a de facto joint investigation team. At first, nothing happened. Then in October 1984, 7 full months after a grand jury indicted the 7 defendants, Los Angeles County Sheriff Sherman Block and the county DA, Bob Filibosian, traveled to Manhattan Beach to talk with Police Chief Kuhlmeyer. The details of what was said behind the closed doors of the police department have never been made public. Officially, at least, the arrival 1 month later of a special 25-man task force of sheriff's deputies to take over the case was the result of a plea from Kuhlmeyer. But parents like Jackie McGawley heard the story differently. The local police really screwed up on the case. It was 16 months before the sheriff's team took over, and when they did, the Manhattan Beach cops just threw a load of boxes with loose papers at them and told them to get on with it. They were really angry that they had been taken off the inquiry. Many of the children interviewed by McFarlane were now disclosing ever more bizarre abuse. The details they gave, matching those from Jackie McGawley's daughter, were of adults dressed up in robes and carrying candles, abuse taking place on what appeared to be altars of local churches, and visits to a local cemetery where Ray Buckey allegedly made them dig up bodies. In fact, the McMartin children disclosures contained every one of Pamela Hudson's key indicators of ritual abuse. They described being tied up and locked in cages. They gave explicit details of witnessing the sacrifice of animals and the draining of their blood. Some of the victims said they had been made to drink the blood. Most described being given what one young girl called the devil's round, a cup full of urine, blood, and feces, which they were forced to consume. The familiar allegations about drugs being administered also emerged. One 4-year-old girl was able to describe the injections she was regularly given at the preschool. Doctors examined her and found evidence of needle scarring to her knees, in her knees and eyebrows, exactly where she claimed to have been injected. When pressed as to why they had never revealed any of this while attending the preschool, the children explained that every so often one of the school's menagerie of small furry animals, mostly rabbits and gerbils, would be killed in front of them. It was intended as an example of what would happen to their parents if they ever told. Simultaneously, according to some of the youngsters, they had been frightened by stories their abusers told of child-eating monsters. Quote, "They told us the monsters would come in the night and try to eat us. The way you make the monsters go away is you sit up in bed and say, 'I promise I'll never tell anyone what happened to me.' And the monsters go away." It is not difficult to imagine the effect of such threats on children barely out of nappies, especially when they'd apparently witnessed and endured an unending catalogue of unspeakable evil. Most told therapists that they had witnessed the killing and dismembering of young babies. One child described in remarkable detail how a baby's eyes were put out during a particular ritual. When asked if she knew what happened to the infant, she explained how its body was taken to a crematorium and incinerated. To their credit, the DA's team of lawyers did not shrink from their stories, perhaps because early on they found some supporting evidence. Several of the older children, many of them boys who had not attended the preschool for several years, had identified an unemployed local handyman as one of their abusers. They had seen his picture in the papers when he was arrested for sexual abuse offences connected to a babysitting service he and a girlfriend ran from a motel in the nearby town of Torrance. Torrance, I've been there. The children never knew his name. That's the place where there's Saddleback Ministry Church or something. The children never knew his name. They identified him only as the Wolfman, but said he had abused them in an Episcopal church wearing a black robe. He had also been involved in the slaughter of pet rabbits. I'm sure it was Torrance where I saw Heidi Baker. I've still got a photograph. I can find out if that was the alleged location. When police searched the man's house, they found one black candle, a black robe, and a pair of rabbit's ears. He never stood trial for the abuse. On the eve of the opening of the babysitting trial, he was found dead, apparently the victim of a drug overdose. Brackets, editorial note by Craig. This individual was Robert Winkler, running the operation out of the Cocoa Palms Motel on Pacific Coast Highway in Lomita, adjacent to and northeast of Torrance, California, one of 2 hotel motels in the area utilized and well known to occultists and low-life deviants, where a plethora of criminal activities took place, including but not limited to child porn, snuff films, satanic ritualistic sacrifice, drug, human trafficking, murder. Activities which continued, as far as I know, well into the 2000s, with a one-time advertisement online for the Harms as rooms for discerning individuals, reservation appointment required. End of editorial note. Jean Machisinka was convinced that drugs had played a part in the McMartin abuse. The children repeatedly talked about being given medicine in the form of injections, tablets, and a strange liquid, which, according to one youngster, made me feel like I was asleep even when I was awake. Every new disclosure took the case on a different track. At least 5 other preschools in the neighboring areas were implicated in the abuse and closed down. Medical tests on the pupils showed, according to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies, quote, substantial numbers of children showing clear signs of abuse. Added to that, adults who had been at McMartin many years before were regularly contacting the investigation to report their own abuse. True or false, each allegation had to be examined. Then there were the additional suspects. Although only Ray Buckey and the 6 women had been indicted by a grand jury, the children's disclosures identified at least 3 dozen other adults. Some were extremely prominent Manhattan Beach citizens. Jean Machisinka prepared the case carefully. 18 children had been chosen as specimen victims when the case went before the grand jury for indictment. Machisinka interviewed each child personally. They had also been medically examined by a pediatrician attached to Key McFarlane's team, Astrid Hoger. She built up a damning dossier of color slides showing what she was convinced were vaginal and anal scars that could not have been caused naturally. These and the disclosures were, however, the only evidence the prosecution could rely on. California courts will generally not place their undiluted faith in children's testimony, at least insofar as it identifies named abusers, unless there is clear supporting evidence. Machisinka and the sheriff's deputies began a desperate search for the videos and photographs the children believed had been taken of the rituals and the abuse. According to Jackie McGawley, quote, they said they went as far as Holland looking for pictures of our kids, but there are a number of problems with that. Firstly, it's real hard to identify little kids, though I suppose they could have identified the adults. But my information is that those videos and photographs are in private hands, not on the streets of Amsterdam. We, some of the parents, put up $1,000 reward to get hold of the pictures. We got a couple of leads from that. A couple of people got in touch, but when they came forward, they reported being threatened. So the whole thing just sort of folded. It's real frustrating to think that there's some creep out there with those pictures of our kids. Magawlay's view of the likely ownership of any such child pornography, showing as it would the death, mutilation and consumption of very young babies and children, is likely to be correct. Whilst much child pornography is still traded through Amsterdam and other Dutch cities, the majority of material made after commercial production was criminalized in 1979, and particularly that which shows highly sadistic abuse is circulated among a number of small, closed circles of individual paedophiles. To break into them, the investigators would have needed to go undercover rather than scour the streets of foreign capitals. And so the case dragged on. The only sign of light was an offer from one of the defendants to plead guilty to a reduced charge in return for giving evidence against the remainder. Tragically, as it would turn out, District Attorney Bob Philibosian turned the offer down flat. All 7 defendants were guilty, he said, and all 7 should face a full trial and ultimate conviction. It was to be his first of several serious errors in judgment. Jean Matusinka was stunned when Philibosian told her she was no longer on the case. He had decided to reassign the case to an aggressive trial lawyer from outside the child abuse unit, Lael Rubin. Although she'd been involved with Joyce Carlin in securing a successful conviction of America's biggest commercial child pornography dealer, Kathy Wilson, that case had been relatively straightforward, thanks to the impressive investigation conducted by Bob Peters and Bill Doran of LAPD's Sexually Exploited Child Unit. Other than that, Rubin's only experience of child abuse work was 2 small incest cases some years previously. Good and quick-thinking prosecutor though she might be in any other field, the McMartin case cried out for experienced hands. It didn't get them. For her 2 senior support colleagues, Rubin chose Glenn Stevens and Christine Johnston. Both lawyers specialized in prosecution cases, Johnston earning a reputation as a careful and meticulous researcher, Stevens as a young buck brimming with self-confidence and naked aggression in court. Stevens would subsequently sabotage the prosecution case by confiding details of its internal divisions to the Los Angeles Times. The original specimen charges against the 7 defendants were increased to 354, and the number of named victims more than doubled. But it quickly became apparent that Rubin and her team had met only a few of the children, and that even where they had, they were clearly not experienced in coping with the unique difficulties presented by the youngsters as witnesses. Such was the chaotic state of the children's advocates as the case progresses through 1984. Surely the parents thought it could get no worse, but it did. Bob Philibosian was simultaneously involved in a bruising election contest to retain his job as DA. His opponent, Ira Reiner, was a tough liberal who, quite understandably, knew nothing more about the McMartin case than she had appeared in the columns of the local papers. Reiner won the election. Knew nothing more about the McMartin case than had appeared in the columns of the local papers. Reiner won the election. The first hurdle he faced was a rapidly called preliminary hearing. The California Supreme Court had ruled several years before that any defendant indicted by a grand jury had the right to a preliminary hearing before the trial itself started. The reasoning behind this was simply that it gave a low-cost opportunity for the defendant to have a public hearing and to cross-examine witnesses, neither are permissible at indictment stage, before any full-scale trial was called. The Supreme Court decided that prosecutors should have no rights to block any request for such a measure. In the McMartin case, both Virginia McMartin and her daughter Peggy waived their rights and elected to go for the full trial. The 5 other defendants, including Ray Buckey, insisted on the preliminary. Because all the alleged offences were to some extent interrelated, Reiner had to agree to a preliminary hearing for all 7 accused. Trials are an expensive way of administering justice. Lawyers, judges, stenographers, witnesses, the entire paraphernalia of the judicial system all costs princely sums. One of the hopes for the preliminary hearing system was that it would cut down on unnecessary costs and weed out bad prosecutions with a minimum of fuss and expense. And in many cases, it's worked. Most prelims in California last a day or 2 at most. The McMartin preliminary hearing was destined to run for 20 solid months and cost more than $6 million. In retrospect, a writer of pulp police fiction could not have created its cast of characters, much less have dreamed of lining them up on either side of a spectacularly difficult case. At the head was the judge assigned to hear the prelim. Judge Aviva Bob was not, by any stretch of the imagination, one of America's more famous or distinguished courtroom presidents. She had once confided to the Los Angeles Times that she couldn't recall what had made her want to become a lawyer, but that she did like being a judge and deciding things. In Los Angeles legal circles, she was generally known as Judge Boob for her lack of judicial acumen. She had never heard any form of child sexual abuse cases before. Lael Rubin, less well prepared than her predecessor in the job, and having to rely on the testimony of very young children, brackets California's 6-year statute of limitations in sexual abuse cases ruled out the older victims, asked Bob to allow them to testify on closed-circuit television. Bob refused. The state appeal court had ruled such devices unconstitutional on the grounds that they'd not been specifically provided for by statute. As a result, the children were forced to take the stand in the same room as adults who they claimed had raped, sodomized, and brainwashed them and threatened to kill either them or their parents. It was a desperately cruel ordeal. Nonetheless, the transcripts reveal that some of the youngsters came through it remarkably well, giving clear and damning evidence. One girl, who'd been ordered to stand lookout in case of approaching parents, spoke lucidly about the abuse. Quote, "I was outside swinging on the swing. Inside was Ray and some children. They had their clothes off. Ray was molesting and abusing the children. For the little girls, he was sticking his penis in their vaginas and his fingers in their behind. And for the little boys, he put his penis in their butt. I'd run in and tell Ray the child's mother was coming. He'd put the children in the bathroom and tell the mother, go in the little yard and they'll be there. He got the child dressed, peeked out the door, and said he found the child in the classroom." Ray Buckey's lawyer set the seal on proceedings that would have been farcical had they not been so deeply serious. Daniel Davis was an energetic objector to almost anything any witness said or any question that was asked. In a hearing which became notable for the number of disreputable interruptions, Davis took the tactic to new depths. Quote, "Rubin, when you were a little girl, did you go to the McMartin school?" Davis, "Objection, Your Honor, she's leading the witness." Judge Bob, objection overruled. Rubin, "Can you tell us who your teachers were?" Davis, "Objection, vague." Rubin, "Do you see Ray here in court today?" Witness, "Yes." Rubin, "What's he wearing?" Davis, "Objection, calls for a conclusion." Bob, overruled. Witness, "A shirt?" Rubin, "Is the shirt a light colour or a dark colour?" David, "Objection, leading question." Bob, overruled. Rubin, Do you see anyone else here in court who was at the school when you were there, who was not a teacher? Davis. Objection. The else makes it vague. Bob. Overruled. Reuben. When you were at Martin, did you ever have to play a game where you had to take your clothes off? Davis. Objection. Leading. Bob. Overruled. So absurd did Davis's behaviour become that Judge Bob's patience finally broke. When he objected that a child witness could not answer a question from Reuben about her date of birth on the grounds that the answer could be hearsay, the child could not have at first hand any reliable knowledge of its birth. Bob told him to hold his tongue. He did not, and she subsequently fined him $500 for contempt. But the tactic was beginning to work. As the weeks and months dragged by, with children kept on the stand interminably, some parents began to have second thoughts about letting their youngsters suffer such an ordeal. The 2 points that sounded the death knell for the case were the introduction of the disclosure videotapes and child witness number 9. The defense wreaked havoc with the tapes. Many showed therapists, Key McFarlane included, asking what were quite clearly leading questions. One of the worst revealed a therapist opening a session with a young girl by telling her that other McMartin children had already disclosed yucky secrets and that every one of the teachers was sick in the head. The tape showed the therapist then asking whether Mr. Ray had ever touched her. The girl shook her head strenuously. Only after persistent questioning, interrogation defense called it, did the child agree that Ray Bucky indeed touched her genitals. A further tape showed 2 therapists going to apparently extraordinary lengths to persuade another girl to talk. She insisted throughout that she had not been abused by anyone at McMartin, so the therapists told her that they themselves had been molested as children and that she would really feel much better if she told them what really happened. McFarlane herself was pilloried on the witness stand. For some of the accusations, notably the leading questions, she had no defense, but there were times when it seemed open season for McFarlane hunting, and that the judge was unwilling to afford her any protection. Just such a point came when a defense lawyer asked her whether she had been abused as a child. It was a grossly improper question, and McFarlane refused to answer it. The defense then asked that her refusal to be formally interpreted as an acknowledgement that she was an abuse victim. Aviva Bob should have stepped in, but she allowed the defense plea, and with it the implication that Key McFarlane was an unreliable witness. Wow. Juvenile witness number 9 was the turning point. The boy gave evidence not only about the sexual molestation he had suffered and witnessed, but also for the first time introduced to the hearing the allegations of ritual abuse. He claimed to have been taken to the Episcopalian Church, brackets the same church as it turned out that Julia McGawley quite independently identified, and beaten with a 10-foot bullwhip. Quote, a priest had slapped him and his friends around if they refused to pray to 3 or 4 gods. The defense teams asked permission to show the witness some photographs to see if he could identify his abusers. He picked, amongst others, those of Ira Reiner and the Hollywood star Chuck Norris. His testimony collapsed around this apparent absurdity. Brackets, had Lael Rubin and her colleagues known it, the identification of prominent celebrities by ritual abuse victims is extremely common. Some specialist therapists now believe that abusers deliberately brainwash these children into believing this with the aim of discrediting their evidence. A speedy decision was taken by the prosecution not to call any other witnesses who had made disclosures of Satanism or ritual abuse. The problem was that this ruled out a large proportion of the victims named in the original charge sheet. Worse, alarmed by the increasingly shambolic hearings, many parents refused to allow their children to give evidence at all. Many others agreed, provided that Judge Bob overturned her ruling about closed-circuit testimony. The state of California, under pressure from the McMartin parents, had finally passed a statute declaring such mechanisms constitutional. But Judge Bob refused to change her mind. The prosecution appealed against the decision and won. But by that time, only one set of parents were left who agreed to their child giving evidence. Of 41 juvenile witnesses scheduled to take the stand, in the end, only 14 ever did so. The result was devastating. With no supporting testimony, Judge Bob had no option but to dismiss more than half of the charges against the 7 accused. The prosecution was in tatters. The children had been ill-prepared and, partly because of their age, were lured by the defense into making damaging, contradictory statements. These were relatively minor in themselves, but together left a picture of confusion. Then there was the problem with the disclosures, some of which even Kee McFarlane had declined to defend. She said later, quote, "There are parts of the tapes that certainly look like children were led into saying things. I think we need to look a lot more closely at children's susceptibility and the way questions are asked. Where I think you get into trouble is when they say somebody touched me and you say, I know it was Mr. Ray. All the kids told me it was Mr. Ray. It was Mr. Ray, wasn't it? That's the leading question. That's asking for a specific answer. Things that are in the therapeutic interest of children are not always in the legal interest, and that's where we've got to get a lot better. On top of these problems, the child witnesses made allegations that seemed utterly preposterous. Walter Urban was defense attorney for one of the McMartin teachers, Betty Rador. In an interview with the American writer David Heckler in 1986, he specifically singles out this bizarre testimony for criticism. Quote, "See, that believe the children thing there," pointing to a small sign in his office, "that question mark I put on, that's a bumper sticker which parents of the children involved and a number of other people put on their cars in the South Bay area. The reason for that is because the kids' versions or the kids' stories became impossible to be believed, such as, I was molested. Where did it occur? In a hot air balloon over the desert, in a ski boat where sharks were all around, and they told us that we were going to be thrown into the sharks if we didn't agree to be molested. That kind of stuff. And you think, what? Where did this occur? Well, it occurred in a tunnel. Where's the tunnel? Under the school. So they dig under the school. There's no tunnel there. There's no nothing. For some reason, this image of the tunnels in which children were abused, a very common key indicator is in virtually every recorded case of ritual abuse, became a fixed yardstick for the McMartin children's unreliability. But how unreliable were their stories? We shall see. The final nail in the prosecution coffin came almost at the end of the preliminary hearing. In September 1985, the Los Angeles Times carried an exclusive. It reported that 2 of the 3 prosecutors had decided there was not enough evidence against 4 of the defendants. The contradictions, according to one of the 3, were killing the prosecution. The source of the article was Glenn Stevens. He had effectively buried the credibility not so much of Lael Rubin's team, but of the McMartin children themselves. The defense case lasted 3 months. It was robust and exhaustive, but it failed to persuade Judge Aviva Bob. On the 9th of January 1986, she ruled that all 7 defendants should stand trial before a jury on child abuse and conspiracy charges. The children's testimony, she said, had been very credible. Of the accused, Ray Buckey faced 82 charges. His mother, Peggy, 24. His sister, Peggy Ann, and 8. Betty Rador was accused on 10 counts. Babette Spiller and Mary Ann Jackson, the other teachers, 4 each. Virginia McMartin, the school's matriarch and now 78 years old, faced only the single charge common to all defendants, conspiracy. If Judge Bob was happy with the case against all 7, Ira Reiner was not. The DA had the power not to bring forward all the charges in trial if he thought there was a distinct possibility that the state would lose. On the 17th of January, Reiner announced that only the cases against Ray Buckey and his mother, Peggy McMartin Buckey, would go ahead. The evidence against them, he said, was very strong and compelling, but not so for the other accused. The decision pleased nobody and made the prospect of any successful trial even more remote than it had already become. The 5 women no longer accused were furious that they'd spent nearly 2 years and most of their savings and were only now thought to be less than culpable. Ray Buckey and Peggy were angry that they too had not been let off. The parents of the McMartin victims were livid. Their children had been put through the hoops both in and out of court, and now this. Reiner's most common defense was that he had inherited the whole mess from his predecessor, Bob Philibosian. He seemed to have forgotten that he had the power to call a halt at any time in the previous 20 months, even during the hearing itself. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan Beach, the related abuse inquiries into other preschools were getting nowhere. Despite the wealth of disclosure evidence, only one playground assistant, an 18-year-old youth, had been brought to trial. The jury had eventually been deadlocked. When they could not agree on a verdict, the prosecutors decided not to attempt a retrial. It was a disturbing premonition of what was to come. By spring 1986, all related investigations had been shut down, and only Ray Buckey and his mother remained under suspicion for the McMartin abuse. Buckey continued to retain the pugnacious Daniel Davis as his lawyer. Davis charged $116 per hour for his services, a fee which fell on the taxpayers of Los Angeles County. Nor had he changed his sensational approach in cross-examination. He attempted to have all the remaining 101 counts dismissed as part of his plea, claiming that Lael Rubin had been having an affair, not with Aviva Bob, but with another male Superior Court judge. This, to Davis's mind at least, suggested the possibility that she might have covertly influenced the collective judicial consciousness against the Buckeys, mother and son. It was preposterous, but completely in keeping with the increasingly vulnerable McMartin prosecution. Rubin denied any such affair, and Davis was unable to substantiate his allegations. Had Judge Bob, for all her faults, still been hearing the case, the defense attorney might have collected a second fine for contempt. But Judge Bob had gone. It never helps when circumstances force a change of judge in the middle of a lengthy litigation. When the case is as complicated and ill-handled as the McMartin prosecution had been, the damage is a particularly severe blow. Judge William Pounders may have had a better reputation than his predecessor, but he had not heard the evidence she had, nor yet had much experience of the antics of the defense. To the parents of the victims, it seemed as if one setback followed another in an unending catalogue of errors. The next banana skin for the prosecution case was again supplied by one of its own. So I have to ask, sorry, editorial, I have to ask, are these banana skins, is this ineptitude, or is it something more complex? As in, people being bribed, blackmailed, threatened, compromised, or complicit. On all levels. every institution around children can be infiltrated and corrupted. Right. So back to the text. The next banana skin for the prosecution case was again supplied by one of its own. Glenn Stevens had been fired from Lael Rubin's team after the Los Angeles Times reports. Very shortly afterwards, he signed up for a fee never disclosed with a Hollywood film scriptwriter called Abby Mann. Stevens was listed as a consultant to a projected drama documentary about the McMartin case. On its own, this might have raised eyebrows. What transformed professional displeasure into yet another body blow for the children's case were more than 30 hours of tape-recorded interviews between Mann and Stevens, detailing previously confidential information about the prosecution case. These were intended to help the writer put together his movie proposal, but instead they helped the defense. During the course of their taped conversations, Stevens announced that he believed both Ray Buckey and Peggy McMartin Buckey to be innocent of all charges. This was despite supporting their prosecution while still retained by Lael Rubin. Somehow, the tapes found their way to Davis. If Judge Pounders refused the defense plea to strike out all charges on the basis of this turnaround, the news was out and the damage was done. McMartin parents were angry beyond belief. Quote, "I put my child in his hands," one mother complained. "He told us he believed us, and he has sold us out for 30 pieces of silver." Stevens' apparent reason for reversing his previously held view was not ostensibly money, although one section of the transcript reveals him to have told Mann that if Ray Buckey and his mother were acquitted, quote, "we'll be sitting on top of the world." Instead, he was evidently concerned that the case relied only on children's testimony without corroborative evidence. The worst, however, was yet to come. During his interviews with Mann, Stevens confided that the prosecution team had been deeply concerned about the mental health of Judy Johnson, the mother whose child had been the first reported case of sexual abuse and who had sparked off the entire investigation. Stevens' accounts showed that Johnson had accused a number of people of abusing her child. Her former husband, an AWOL U.S. Marine, absent without leave U.S. Marine, member of a Los Angeles health club and one member of a local school board, and had said that Ray Buckey could fly. The resulting furor required yet another legal inquiry. This time, an evidentiary hearing for Judge Pounders to consider whether the defense should have been told about the Johnsons' worries right from the start. Among other problems, this meant calling Glenn Stevens to the stand. Stevens promptly took the Fifth Amendment to avoid prosecution. The issue of Johnson's sanity and who knew what when, and why the defense hadn't been told, became central. It was clear, even to those who read the press reports of the increasingly bizarre legal antics, that Judy Johnston's state of mind was going to be crucial in the ultimate trial. The fact that UCLA doctors still insisted that her son had been abused seemed to have been forgotten. Several weeks later, Judy Johnston died. Oh my God. An editorial from Craig. Right, question mark, question mark. After days of intense and public speculation, the coroner announced a verdict of natural causes. She had died of liver failure, but that in turn had been caused by excessive alcohol consumption. Judy Johnson had drunk herself to death. It was a fitting beginning to the end of a fatally weakened case. In the middle of all this, Ray Buckey put in an application for bail. Oh, he made a heartfelt plea, quote, "I never in my life threatened a child, nor can I comprehend how anyone could. I do believe that this case should and must go to trial. The truth must be known and understood, the truth of my innocence." And Craig writes, "Sorry, I just threw up in my mouth a bit." Brackets, "and my mother's innocence and the truth of the wrong that has been done to the 7 teachers and the innocent families of the children." Who does this sound like? To say I don't fear for my future in the trial is a lie, but one thing I don't fear, Your Honour, is the truth of my innocence and my mother's innocence. To put it simply, the truth will set me free. Judge William Pounders failed to set Buckey free. Pounders told the defendants, their counsel, and the court that the case was strong and that many of the children's statements appeared to be spontaneous and have the ring of truth. In January 1990, the trial that had begun nearly 7 years before ground to a halt. Jurors cleared Peggy Buckey of all the remaining 12 charges of child molestation. But with Ray Buckey, they had a problem. On the vast majority of counts, there were 53 in total, they cleared him. But in 13, they deadlocked, reaching no conclusion. Ira Reiner, still DA and still in charge of prosecuting the case, decided to press ahead with a retrial on a reduced list of 8 charges involving just 3 small girls. In late April, the new hearings convened. For 3 months, a new panel of jurors listened to the now familiar evidence. For a further 3 weeks, they deliberated in private before announcing that they were, like those that had gone before, hopelessly deadlocked. Another mistrial was declared. This time, Ira Reiner had had enough. And again, when a jury is deadlocked and it's a trial that's so serious, one has to ask, were any jurors nobbled or threatened? This time, Ira Reiner had had enough. The County of Los Angeles had spent $13.5 million on the case to no avail. Quote, "There has been a mighty effort and there is no verdict," the DA announced on the 27th of July. "I think there is reason to say enough at this point." Ray Buckey, who'd spent more than 5 years in jail, had other things to say. Quote, "It was Salem revisited, McCarthyism one more time. I've gone from probably one of the most hated people you could ever mention to a point where everyone that comes up to me now is very sympathetic." Not quite everyone, perhaps. Daniel Davis, Buckey's aggressive lawyer, was asked if the victim's parents would ever accept his client's innocence. "I don't think they can," he said. Jackie McGawley would agree with that. She and her daughter were not part of the trial circus directly. Julia was too young to be considered good material for the witness stand, and in any event, spent only 5 months at McMartin. In addition, her disclosures were quite clearly indicative of satanic ritual abuse. Quote, "I went through the stage of asking whether my daughter had got this wrong. Then I remembered the details she'd given me of the crematorium where she said she'd seen bodies all burned up. I couldn't understand how a child of that age would know how a crematorium worked. I decided I would take her to the place she'd described. It was clearly identifiable. She'd never been there before, with me or her father. I asked her to describe the insides of the place for me before we went in, and she just said, clocks. Again, I couldn't work this out until we went inside. There on the wall of the office was a very big and prominent clock. It dominated the room, and I began to understand. I kept talking with Julia, and one time I asked her why she hadn't told me before about the abuse when she was going to the preschool. She told me they had said she would die if she told anyone, and I remembered the first night she had disclosed. The next day I had to go into town and leave her with a friend. I went before she woke in the morning. When I got back, she had gone into this really bad asthma attack. It was clear to me much later that she had thought I really had died when she didn't see me that morning. And no, she didn't have asthma before she went to McMartin. The public perception of McMartin dismisses the experience of children like Julia. McMartin was seen as a weird case where kids fantasized bizarre, impossible things, and a bunch of way-out therapists helped launch a witch hunt. In Britain, the New Statesman magazine summed up the prevailing mood. Quote, "Why did this hysteria begin? In the hysterical atmosphere, the prosecutors felt they could get away with anything, and journalists eagerly lapped up their charges. Society was ripe for a witch hunt, and the accumulated energies poised for this end displaced themselves into the virtuous cause of hunting for body snatchers of the American nation's children. The charges made by the children at the McMartin School were gothic in their detail of their sexual exploitation. They claimed to have witnessed devil worship at a church, been involved in nude photography, had foreign objects including sticks, silverware and screwdrivers stuck up their behinds, been taken by their captors to mortuaries, cemeteries and funeral homes, been flown in airplanes, been given red or pink liquid that made them sleepy, been buried alive, seen priests cavorting naked in the secret cellar below the school." The New Statesman, like many other publications, reviewed the trials and pronounced itself dissatisfied. No bodies, no bones were ever found, no child pornography was recovered, and the much talked about tunnels never existed. But in fact, the tunnels did exist. Subsequent excavation, organized by a McMartin parent, finally brought to light physical corroboration of what the children described. The January 1991 report, commissioned from the independent archaeologist Dr. Gary Stickle, who carried out the works, is revealing. Quote, "Report on the tunnels found at McMartin Preschool. A 45-foot tunnel, 9-foot wide subterranean entrance found under the west wall of classroom 4, Ray Bucky's classroom. Disney bag, copyright 1982, found 4.5 feet below the classroom floor and 3 to 6 inches in from the entrance under the foundation. Tunnel proceeded south, then east 45 feet, then north, then east 10 feet. Tunnels were 30 inches wide with top of tunnel 30 inches under the classroom floor. The footing beneath classrooms 3 and 4 arched where the tunnel passed underneath. 4 large upright containers were found in the tunnel, obviously hand-placed. A 9-foot wide chamber was found along the tunnel under classroom 4. Tunnel features made it evident that it was hand-dug. B, 7-foot tunnel extending into the triplex next door. Tunnel extended from the bathroom, off the office and classroom 1 to the front yard of the triplex. Children described entrance and exit tunnel exactly where tunnel, exit and entrance were found. C, other significant facts. A small white plastic plate with 3 pentagrams, hand-drawn, on top of light green paint was found by the archaeologist in the stratified dirt in the play yard. According to historical archaeologists, pentagrams were hand-drawn by an adult and not part of the manufacturer's design. Each classroom had on and off light switch labeled fire alarm. The system did not connect to the fire station, but was used as an alert within the school. The truth about the satanic ritual abuse fiasco at McMartin is not that it demonstrates the inherent implausibility of such allegations. Rather, it highlights the pathetic inability of law enforcement to handle such cases successfully. It took 7 years and $13.5 million for police, therapists, and district attorneys to botch the evidence. It took Jackie McGawley $40,000 in a matter of months to provide the corroboration the children so desperately needed, the existence of the tunnels. If McMartin exemplifies chaotic incompetence, then our second case study reeks of something far more sinister. In Nottingham, evidence was deliberately concealed and attempts made to silence those voices who spoke out. That took place not among the abusers themselves, but amongst the ranks of senior detectives and social service department managers. The council estate of Broxtowe occupies a sizable, if neglected, plot on the northeast outskirts of Nottingham. I'm going to take a break. I'll continue this in this video, but I'm just going to take a break before we go on to the Nottingham case. All right, so now we're going on to the Nottingham case, and for anybody doing research Mickey Summers and Nottingham ICSA 2019 in the UK. Right, here we go, share screen. Okay. The council estate of Broxtowe occupies a sizable, if neglected, plot on the north-east outskirts of Nottingham. Designed in a neat oval, from the air it most closely resembles a giant athletics running track, dissected by 4 diagonal major roads. The houses built on semicircular avenues have crumbled into sordid dilapidation. Poverty, mental, physical, and emotional, is endemic in Broxtowe. Petty crime, violence, and drunkenness a way of life. Families tend to be larger than in the discreetly middle-class suburbs and villages that surround it. Prostitution is rife in a mean and petty way. Women sell themselves and fathers their children to make ends meet, rather than from commercial acumen. It is without question a dank, miserable, and depressing place to exist. It was into this Dickensian atmosphere that in 1932, a 4-year-old Scottish boy arrived. Derek, brackets, because of the requirements of wardship and care law restrictions, none of the people in this section may be identified, was the 4th of 18 children in his family, and by all accounts grew up deprived, weary, and embittered. That same year, Irene was born in one of the shoddy houses that ringed the area. Her family, though less extensive than her future husband's, was no better off. At the age of 10, she left school to work in a local factory. By 1946, Derek was a private doing national service in the army, while Irene was still living at home, still sweating out her days in the factory. At some point in the next 6 years, the couple met, had sex, and conceived a baby. Family records held by Nottingham Social Services show that the resulting child, a boy they called Paul, died at the age of 2 months from laryngitis. The same year, 1953, his parents were married. Less than 12 months later, Irene gave birth to another son, Tommy. Between then and 1959, he would be joined by 3 siblings, Glenda, Kieran, and Trevor. The family first came to the notice of the council's welfare workers in 1961, when a case conference was held on the grounds of persistent rent arrears. Cool. For a brief period, Derek, Irene, and their 4 children were evicted and moved away from Broxtowe. It was to be a short absence. Between 1961 and 1967, Irene gave birth to 4 more children, all girls, Avril, Diana, Michelle, and Valerie. The overcrowded family home, now back on the familiar estate, was not a happy place to grow up. Derek was working, quote, on the knock, a traditional Nottingham practice of selling poor quality household items door to door in the prosperous south of England. Meanwhile, all 4 elder children were involved in petty crime. In January 1967, Tommy was taken into council care after his umpteenth offence of housebreaking and larceny. He was 12. 2 months later, Glenda, Trevor and Avril were caught shoplifting. All were given police cautions. By the end of the year, Trevor had clocked up a second caution for the same offence. In December 1967, Nottingham Social Services held a special case conference on the problems within Derek's extensive family. The reason was that an unnamed source had suggested to social workers that Glenda was being abused by her father. The department ordered a medical examination of the 13-year-old girl. It showed that her hymen had been broken and that she was clearly exhibiting medical signs of penile penetration. Curiously, nothing was done with that information, nor with additional data supplied to the case conference, which revealed that Derek had a number of convictions, mostly for theft, dating back to 1940. Perhaps the reason that no prosecution ensued from the incest revelations was that the victim, Glenda, was registered as educationally subnormal. She and her similarly registered brother, Trevor, in the absence of any more constructive assistance, were sent to a special day school which catered for their particular needs. 1 month later, in January 1986, another case conference was held. This time, the cause was Derek and Irene's regular practice of going out at night and leaving the children alone in the house. Another month on, and Glenda was once more caught shoplifting. Within 2 days, she had joined Tommy in council care. Her respite from home did not last long. By November, she was back in the small and dirty semi-detached house and back in her father's bed. The rest of the 60s, that decade of hope, love and peace, continued in much the same bestial fashion for Derek's children. Care orders came and went. Trevor was badly beaten up by his father, and he and Avril were removed from home. Derek was given a probation upon conviction and continued to abuse his daughter. Nor was this the only incest taking place. He had begun routinely to have sex with his other daughters and his sons. They in turn were encouraged to sleep with each other. The house became a nest of vicious and inextricable abuse. The 1970s began much as the previous decade had ended. Derek found time to have sex with Irene, and 2 more children were added to the family in 1971 and 1972. Their brothers and sisters committed a series of petty and unprofitable thefts. Frequently, they would be severely beaten by Derek, sometimes needing hospital treatment. That only Avril and Trevor were afforded the relative comfort of council care in the years between 1970 and 1975 remains something of a mystery. That year, 1975, was the turning point. Michelle and Diana joined Avril in care as a result of incest evidence. Valerie, together with Andrew and Margaret, the 2 youngest children, followed on when Irene abandoned them in the precincts of Nottingham Court. Trevor was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Irene was convicted of 4 counts of petty fraud, and Derek was finally jailed for sexually abusing Glenda. The year ended with Irene alone in the house. All 10 children were in some form of state institution. Valerie was later to remember the 9 years she spent in care as the happiest of her life. Quote, "At home, my dad was always at us kids, doing things, sexual things to us. My mum knew, she even watched him. I hated them both. They ruined all of our childhoods. We never had nothing but pain." But the abuse wasn't simply sexual or physical. Valerie clearly remembers her parents' distinctly twisted religious belief system. Quote, "My mother believed in what was happening to us kids. She would always tell us that there was a devil, but there was no God. There's no God, there's only the devil, and she worshipped him." In 1975, the majority of such revelations were a long way off, and even had they been made, it is unlikely that either Nottingham Police or social services would have paid them much attention. Derek's family had become just another bunch of dirty subhuman flotsam who collectively added up to a persistent administrative headache. As Derek's children grew through adolescence and into adulthood, they were returned one by one from care to their parents' home. Glenda was the first, and she quickly struck up a relationship with a local man, Steve. By 1976, she'd given birth to a boy, Kevin. A year later, Glenda married Steve, and Alison was born. It is surprising, given the known history of Glenda and the consistent pattern of incest within her father's house, that more attention was not paid to this third generation of children. Although case notes reveal concern at physical neglect, it was not until 1980, by which time Claire had arrived, that care orders were issued. Even then, this was based on the physical condition of the three youngsters. They were frequently infested with lice, left in dirty nappies or alone in the house. Their speech development was minimal, their health at risk. Ironically, much of this evidence of neglect stemmed from medical checkups that social workers ordered at the local hospital. No one apparently thought to check for evidence of sexual abuse. Other children followed. Steve and Glenda produced 2 more girls and a boy. Derek's second son, Kieran, fathered 5 babies to 2 different mothers on the estate. Trevor managed 1, Avril 2. Diana gave birth to 4 babies, and Michelle followed on with 2 boys of her own. By 1984, there were 17 children living in houses occupied by Derek's extensive family. More joined them as new partners replaced old, bringing in children by older relationships. That all these children lived in such closeness to a family with such a clear history of child abuse, yet without attracting much attention from police or social services, speaks volumes about the priority their case was assigned. The spur to action came only in June 1986. Alison, by then 7 years old, had been observed masturbating furiously. When challenged by her foster mother, she described how her own mother would touch her genitals. She said she was frightened to go home. The possibility of Alison being returned to her parents was at that point very real. Glenda and Steve had started legal proceedings to regain the care of their children. But then in May 1985, Claire's abnormal sexual behavior confirmed the accounts of incest her elder sister had already given. She was discovered at school one day with her pants down and guiding the hand of a small boy towards her genitals. She then encouraged him to put his, quote, tail in her tuppence. This was a classic symptom, officially described as learned behavior of abused children everywhere. The children were interviewed and disclosed their own abuse at the hands of their parents. It was the start of a rolling procession of disclosures that would result, by the summer of 1987, in 23 children from the extended family being placed in council care. It was the biggest child sexual abuse case of its type. Unlike Cleveland, the victims were all in some way related that Britain had ever seen. Some of the children came into care in dribs and drabs. When they did, the pattern was generally the same. Each displayed clear evidence of sexual abuse, often acting out sex acts with other toddlers at play groups, and usually implicating their parents. But there was something else beyond that. And it was not simply the curious obsession with feces and urine that some of the youngest boys and girls displayed. There was, in these abused youngsters, an unusual level of fear that was almost tangible. Social services case notes indicate that the foster mother entrusted with Michelle's 2 children was particularly struck by this hyper anxiety. She kept a diary of her daily life with Mark and Dean, recording carefully each bout of panic. Quote, Mark has shown a great fear of Kieran, his father. He has developed wetting and soiling and often a fear of going to bed or going downstairs. He also shows a lot of fear around, quote, a big mister. Like their cousins, Mark and Dean were giving information to their foster mother and therapist from the newly created Team 4 about other children within and outside the extended family who'd been abused. This information was quickly passed on to Nottingham Police. Intern headquarters farmed the problem out to a local substation near Broxtowe Estate. In January 1987, a special unit was set up within the police station to handle the Broxtowe case. At its head was an experienced detective who had grown up in the city and worked for much of his career in and around the estate where Derek's extended family lived. Superintendent Peter Coles is tall and amiable, an old-school copper with a face that resembles nothing more than a well-aged baked potato. Not by any means an intellectual, Coles would nonetheless have been an ideal man for the job were it not for 2 distinct personality traits. Like many officers who've come up the hard way in the midst of an irredeemably criminal community, Coles is genuinely, if arrogantly, convinced that no one could be better informed or equipped to handle whatever crime occurs on his patch. Coupled with this belief is an abiding and typical of many detectives' masculine distrust of women in positions of authority. The group of social workers who made up Team 4 was almost exclusively female, and at its head was Judith Dawson. Dawson is an almost complete opposite to Coles, a comfortably untidy woman with a ready and sharp wit, a very real intellectual ability, and a firm, if carefully controlled, dislike of the macho culture which permeates most police forces. From the start, this was not going to be an easy alliance. The circumstances were not made any easier by contemporary events in Cleveland. The removal of 121 children into care caused a chasm of disagreement to open up between police and social services in the town. As summer turned to autumn that year, opinions polarized in social services and police departments up and down the country. Nottingham was not immune. Nonetheless, the joint inquiry set up to handle what had become known as the Broxtowe case worked well in the early days. According to Judith Dawson, quote, there was a great deal of goodwill on both sides and a determination to try to work together. The atmosphere created by Cleveland meant that a great deal of maturity was required of us all. We faced enormous difficulties which we had to resolve. Chiefly, we needed to decide together what kind of and how much evidence the police would need to take out a criminal prosecution. How could social workers carry out our statutory duty of giving therapy without contaminating the children's evidence? And which of us, police or social services, should have priority? What made this more than academic interest was the nature of the disclosures beginning to emerge from the children. By November 1987, many of their stories contained extremely bizarre details. Adults dressed up as clowns or, quote, witches, and the apparent drinking of blood. There was a pattern about the disclosures that was visible to Dawson and her colleagues. Quote, when the children were taken into care and then into foster homes, it took a while for them to feel safe. Remember, these kids had been through a miserable time, constantly used as sexual objects by their parents. But when they felt safe, the nature of the disclosures changed. Suddenly, and quite spontaneously, they talked about what were apparently some sort of religious type ceremonies. Of course, their language wasn't well enough developed to express it that way, but it was quite clear that they were trying to tell us something outside the ordinary nature, the ordinary routine abuse that they had been put through. The police heard those details too, but neither any agency could make much sense of them. In the meantime, several of the children's parents were making strenuous efforts to regain custody, or at the least to win access rights. It was agreed by their joint team that wardship orders should be sought for all the known victims. Just looking for a sign saying recording. I hope this is. Okay. The wardship application itself was the responsibility of Nottingham Social Services. When it made its plea before Mrs. Justice Booth, sitting in Nottingham High Court, the department made no attempt to hide the nature of the bizarre disclosures. That in turn led the judge to describing the abuse the children had evidently undergone as, quote, satanic. It was the first official use of the word throughout the case, and one that angered Superintendent Coles. Quote, the judge said that on the basis of evidence which the social services put before her, I wouldn't have done that. I wasn't convinced about these so-called satanic ceremonies. Anyway, when the wardship order was made, it stopped the children being interviewed by my officers. It was decided and agreed by the judge that disclosure work should be done by the foster parents, who would report on the results to the social services. They would then let us know what had been said. The problem with that is that interpreting the word these children said is a matter of experience and judgment. And one word could be interpreted by different people in different ways, depending on whether they were approaching it with an open mind. The detectives and the social workers adopted different opinions about the satanic disclosures almost from the start. Although both had agreed well enough for 10 adult members of the children's family to be arrested in February 1988, brackets their grandfather, mothers, fathers, and various lovers, from that point on, the joint investigation foundered on the rocks of police disbelief. Not that Dawson's team were accepting everything the children said as automatically and empirically true. Quote, we didn't know what to make of the stories at first. We didn't have any context in which they made sense. We certainly weren't going about announcing that this was a case of satanic ritual abuse, because in those days we didn't really know anything about that. We just knew that the children believed these stories and that we had to find a way of dealing with their fears and helping them get better. As part of that attempt, Dawson and the senior area social worker on the case, Christine Johnston, set about researching the background. At that stage, they thought they were looking for details of witchcraft rather than Satanism. The children talked constantly about, quote, witches being present and abusing them in a circle. Even Peter Coles, despite his skepticism, had taken to calling these instances of multiple abuse, quote, witch parties. The first contact Dawson and Johnston made was with a specialist in treating sex offenders, Ray Wire. Wire is a gentle but immensely tough former probation officer who began working with paedophiles, rapists, and child murderers while stationed in high-security prisons and made it into his life's work thereafter. In 1988, he set up a private, now charitable, unit to carry on the work. It is called the Gracewell Clinic and is based in a large house in Birmingham. Johnston and Dawson had been to several of Wire's lectures in which he tried to teach social workers about the reality of paedophilic behaviour and the best way to protect children from them. They knew from them that he had also been trained in psychological profiling of offenders by the FBI. They made contact with him early in February 1988. It was to be a very important date. Team 4 itself was well staffed and dedicated to its job. Although Cole's detectives had arrested most of the extended family, there were still a handful of adult members, David's daughters and his son's former lovers, who had not been charged. Gradually, 3 of these women came forward to talk to the therapists. What they had to say made the social workers extremely uneasy. The 3 were not close. They had little or no contact with each other. Firstly, there was Valerie, Derek's daughter, whom he had abused before she was taken into care. Then there was Mary, Trevor's former wife, a small, lonely and frightened woman barely out of her teens. Finally, there was Jennifer, once married to Kieran, but thereafter passed around between the men in the family. Jennifer was not merely educationally subnormal, she was slow-witted and simple. One by one, the women told the social workers about rituals they had attended in a number of houses, both on and off the Broxtowe estate. With varying degrees of clarity, they described large numbers of men and women wearing robes, carrying candles, chanting, abusing children inside stars and circles painted on the floor, and ultimately the sacrifice of animals or the torture and killing of babies. Valerie's accounts were typical. Quote, I went to one party where there was a cross on the wall inside the corner of the room, and my dad had got the cross facing downwards. There was a sheep involved and its throat was cut, and the kids made to drink its blood. There was a star in the middle of the floor, there were candles, the people had cloaks on. My mum was there and she had a big black and red book. She opened it and there was a ritual in it that she read out. She used to chant in a language I couldn't understand. Sometimes there would be a snake in a sort of coffin box and the children were put into the box with the snake. They used to scream. My mother said it was good to do that. Then the snake would be killed. There were 3 aspects to these disclosures that particularly convinced the social workers of Team 4. The first was that in telling their stories, the women haltingly and painfully admitted taking part in the abuse themselves. They said they did so under the threat of extreme violence. The second was that each independently described being taken to identical large and secluded homes where even more grotesque ceremonies were held by, quote, posh people, using the children provided by the Broxtowe contingent. The third aspect, and the most startling, was that these accounts matched exactly what the child victims were telling their foster parents in homes across the city. Dawson recalls, quote, these women had no access to these children. There was virtually no contact between any of the adults and any children. We stopped that after we found that one youngster had been abused by his father during an access visit. What's more, the details both children and adults gave were very specific, down to the interior contents of the houses. Some described a swimming pool inside one mansion. The descriptions matched. How could they have done that if they hadn't been there? This was a conundrum that Superintendent Coles was not prepared to face. By the beginning of April 1988, he had rejected outright any allegations of satanic ritual, and with them, the claims that wealthy local citizens were involved. Quote, the kids in the foster homes started making these disclosures, and it's true that some of them were backed up by some of what the adults said, but we investigated and found the allegations weren't true, and so we discarded them. The problem was caused with the adults by the fact that they were virtually living in the social services department. They'd say anything to please the social workers because they wanted to keep their attention. They were very unreliable women. Not, however, so unreliable that the police would discard their evidence entirely. As Cole's team built up the case, they came to take for granted that Mary and Valerie would testify when the time came for court. At the same time, the detective insisted that there was to be no mention at the trial of any allegations of Satanism, rituals, or posh houses. Dawson and Team 4 were first forced to grit their teeth and accept the decision. What they could not accept, indeed were bound by law not to, was that the clear identification of other children involved would not be pursued. The social workers resolved to turn detective. The process had partly been started by their meeting with Ray Wire at the Gracewell Clinic. They had come to Birmingham, an hour's drive south, to ask for his advice. Quote, I told them not to give any details. I simply said that in my experience that if there was satanic ritual abuse present, some of a list of indicators would figure. I gave them an outline of the most common allegations. It matched indicator for indicator. After that, I agreed to see the foster parents, but only because they'd already heard the details from the children themselves. I never put the idea of ritual abuse in their minds. That suggestion, potential contamination of the evidence, began to dominate police social services relations throughout 1988 and until the trial was over in February 1989. Coles and his team refused to believe that the children had disclosed spontaneously, claiming that Wire had suggested the idea of Satanism to the foster parents, who in turn put it into the minds of their charges. The fact that Mark's disclosure diaries, of which the police had copies, in particular, revealed that he had made clear references to ritual abuse 3 months before Wire had been consulted, did not appear to concern the detectives. They never bothered to ask Wire when he talked to the foster parents. Instead, they carried out a second investigation to check again whether the ritual abuse claims could have been genuine. Coles emerged satisfied with the result. Quote, our first investigation, the one which targeted the adults and resulted in their prosecution, was codenamed Bilbo. After that, we launched a further inquiry with the codename Gollum, both drawn from the fantasy classic The Lord of the Rings. In Gollum, which was largely a paper exercise, we tracked down where each of a number of key words, for example, baby or sheep, were first mentioned in the context of what was claimed to be a ritual. We found that we could trace it back to a single source, a snippet of conversation perhaps, and that after that it had been repeated by children who did have some limited access to each other. It wasn't a genuine case of mass disclosure of the same thing. The problem with this academic technique, aside from the obvious issue of what prompted the first disclosure, was that it could not take account of how the children described certain incidents or their evident trauma when doing so. According to Christine Johnston, quote, some of them talked about having to drink blood. Now, when they did this, they were able to say that it was warm and tasted yucky, and that had a sort of oily feel to it. When they told us about touching it, they said it sort of stuck to the fingers. Now, that sort of detail, vivid and actually correct, is beyond a child's ability to fantasize. We came to the reluctant but inescapable conclusion that they must have experienced what they said. Because of the research she and Dawson had put in, background reading that Cole's team did not undertake, the therapists had been able to find a potential context for the children's disclosures, a context that would at least attempt to explain the bizarre events they described. One example concerned, quote, poppets. For months, Dawson was unable to make any sense of the word. The children talked about these things being used in rituals and chanting going on before the poppets were burned in a fire. We couldn't understand what they meant until we did some research. Then we found that poppets are a sort of doll used by some occult groups in their ceremonies. It seemed to fit. Dawson was right. The use of poppets is well recorded in occult handbooks. Some authorities suggest that they are fashioned from amongst other ingredients, poison ivy berries collected in a graveyard, shaped into the form of a human figure, and used within a circle painted on the floor to lay a curse by proxy. Part of the ritual involves stabbing the baby-like figure. This description matches almost step for step the incidents described by the Broxtowe children. When they arrested the abusers, detectives had even found a photograph in one house showing a wax-type doll placed between the naked thighs of an adult woman. The police, however, had come up with an alternative explanation. According to Coles, quote, "This started off as a disclosure from one particular child. He said the word puppet, but I think he actually meant puppies. We know that some of the kids probably saw a dog give birth to pups in the house, and these were either buried or drowned." Perhaps unsurprisingly, Team 4 were becoming increasingly frustrated by Cole's attempts to find anodyne explanations, however unlikely, in a bid to defuse the Satanic disclosures. The most serious point of disagreement as the trial grew close was over the allegations that, quote, "posh people from big houses were involved and that the children had been taken to tunnels under various parts of Nottingham to be abused." When the detectives refused to investigate those allegations, Dawson and Johnston returned to what they called our Miss Marple Act. They managed to identify one of the houses from the matching testimony of the children and the adult women. They took to keeping watch on it periodically and attempting to find out about its occupants. This was to lead them into ever greater conflict with Superintendent Coles and his team. In March 1989, Coles explained, quote, "It's quite wrong and dangerous to label someone a Satanist on very little evidence. It's an easy thing to say, but a very hard one to disprove. There are no tunnels under that part of Nottingham. We know because we checked it out." If so, Coles can't have looked too far or too hard. The children described being taken through a doorway into a tunnel running under Wallerton Hall, a large and listed stately building now used to house a museum. Sure enough, the door exists, as does the tunnel, just as described by the Broxtowe children. Nor was it open to the public. There was no legitimate way for them to have known about it, let alone given a detailed description. In addition, that part of the city sits astride a myriad network of mining tunnels stretching back from the 1860s to the 16th century. All records are kept at the Mining Records Office at the disused Newstead's Colliery near Mansfield. In February 1989, the sole collator was happy to get out the historic maps for me. It was, he said, the first time in many years that anyone had looked at them. Some run directly under the, quote, "posh houses," just as the children and adults described. By then, the trial of Derek and his sons, daughters, and loose relatives was in progress. There was, on police insistence, no mention of Satanism or rituals in the courtroom. The 9 members of the second generation pled guilty. Only Derek held out for a full trial. It made no difference. At the end of February, the 10 were jailed on charges of incest, assault, buggery, and neglect for a total of more than 150 years. But for Team 4, the case was far from over. The children still seemed to need constant disclosure work. Quote, "Once they started talking," recalled Dawson, "we couldn't stop them. There was so much they wanted to tell us." This led to yet more suspicion. At one point in April that year, relations were so bad between the detectives and therapists that Judith Dawson found herself apparently under police surveillance. On the 13th of April, she phoned my office. Quote, "I went to a meeting earlier this month at Police HQ. In the course of it, I was confronted with a written list of every meeting but one that I have ever had with you. It was entirely accurate. Times, dates, even the restaurants we went to. I can think of only one way they could have got that information. Those meetings had not been recorded in Dawson's diary, and mine never left my side. Surveillance was the only answer. Certainly, Nottingham police were extremely nervous that spring about information Dawson had been seeking about a particular adult identified by the Broxtowe witnesses. 2 official files on his finances and his family had disappeared suddenly after she began making inquiries. The timing was curiously coincidental, leaving the police as much in the dark as Dawson. The same witness continued to spill forth new details quite independently. For a time, Coles was prepared to listen to each allegation that Team 4 reported to him. But by late spring, he had all but given up, convinced that the therapists had been bitten by a satanic bug and were busy brainwashing the children into ever greater fantasies. Quote, "One of the greatest difficulties in a case of this nature is making sure that nobody asks leading questions. If you ask that sort of question, particularly to a child who's not had the ordinary love and affection that most people's kids have had, and when they make a response to the question, somebody says, 'Well done,' that's become a reward and may prompt further untrue disclosures." When in May 1989, Coles was pressed during a television interview to find any such leading questions in Mark's key satanic disclosures recorded on tape in January 1988, he was, however, unable to substantiate his theory. A video film of the interview shows him to be at a loss to explain the clear and unprompted descriptions of rituals. When the tape finished, a senior Nottingham police officer remonstrated furiously with the television crew for putting Coles in the hot seat under that sort of spotlight. In the summer of 1989, and under pressure from Nottingham's former chief constable, the incoming director of social services for the county council abruptly banned Dawson, Johnson, or any other member of Team 4 from talking publicly about the case. David White had arrived at County Hall after the successful prosecution to discover open warfare between his staff and the local police. With the stinging criticisms of Lord Justice Butler Sloss over a similar breakdown in Cleveland still ringing around the local government world, White decided to gag his therapists in the hope of patching up the dispute. Wow. With that in mind, he also announced the setting up of a new joint inquiry team to be known as JET, comprising 2 social workers and 2 police officers. Its brief was to investigate the circumstances of the Broxtowe case, the issue of whether Satanism had been involved, and the row between the agencies. It was based at West Bridgford Police Station. White's choice of social workers to run the inquiry was, to say the least, distinctly odd. The senior member was David Long, his partner Margaret Gregory. Long should never have been appointed. There were 2 grounds to disbar him. The first, that he'd been criticised a year previously for his handling of a child sex case. One person involved in making that criticism was Judith Dawson, the woman whose work he was now required to assess. The second impediment was more serious still, though whether David White could have known it is uncertain. Long asked a number of people concerned in the case and with experience of ritual abuse to give evidence to the inquiry. I was one. This is Tim Tate speaking. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday, the 3rd of October, 1989, I was ushered into the small jet office at West Bridgford Police Station. Only the social workers were present, but Margaret Gregory took copious and apparently verbatim notes of the interview in longhand. During the course of the morning, Long ventured his own opinion that some of the allegations were preposterous. In particular, the claim that, quote, posh adults in large houses had controlled the abuse. Quote, I know in at least one case that to be false, he said. He went on to explain that one of those identified by the children was a, quote, close personal friend, just like Butler Sloss and Leon Britton. That's me. This was how he knew the allegation to be false, that his friendship should have disqualified him from the inquiry never occurred to Long. There were other incongruities about the Jet. It decided not to interview either team for or the specially constituted police squad which had dealt with the Broxtowe case. Quite reasonably, it did not re-interview any of the children involved. But what of the foster mothers, the people who'd done almost all the disclosure work with these children? Not a single one was called to give evidence to the inquiry. Yet theirs was the only first-hand experience of the satanic ritual abuse allegations. Instead, the Jet asked Professor John Newson, head of the Child Development Centre at Nottingham University, to review some of the disclosure diaries. In itself, this was an odd choice. Newson is an expert on normal child development, not sexual abuse. He wrote a paper for the inquiry based on his reading of a few excerpts from the transcripts and floated the theory that the children had been, quote, brainwashed into making up stories of Satanism. He based this on the transcript of one very late interview between a social worker and a disturbed teenage boy, alleged by many of the young victims to have been present during the rituals. The transcript revealed that at one point, according to Newson, the social worker had suggested, quote, that the facts were not in dispute. For many of the facts, that was faulty. This is a procedure which might well be described as brainwashing. Even ignoring the slender thread upon which this conclusion was based, Newson appeared to be ignorant of the fact that the vast majority of all disclosure work had been undertaken not by social workers but by the foster parents. Still, he boasted later, they might have brainwashed the children too. Quote, well, I don't know about the belief system of the people who were working with the children or how they would respond to suggestions from the children that they've been involved in evil practices of an unholy nature. That would presumably depend on the beliefs and values those particular foster parents hold. If they were strongly evangelical Christians, they might take a very different view that if they were more relaxed, atheistic, or less convinced believers in hell, the devil, and all that. It apparently never occurred to Professor Newson to ask the foster parents concerned about their religious affiliations. Had he done so, he would have found a spread of ordinary, non-evangelical church attenders mixed with the secular and uninterested. But Newson never met the foster parents before writing his report. Nor did he see many disclosure documents. Quote, I saw parts of interviews with 3 or 4 children, he admitted later. This is a bit like Joe Fantonda being asked to give an assessment of the Hampstead case along with some others and just being given limited information. And then when he had questions, not being given answers. He was wheeled in to do a report from the perspective of parental alienation, like fathers wrongly accused. And even he dropped the case and said, no, I can't work with this. I'm not happy with Scotland Yard's responses to valid questions I had. And then he got threatened and intimidated afterwards for speaking to me. Right, back to the script. He says, I saw parts of interviews with 3 or 4 children, he admitted later. On the basis of this weak hypothesis, the Jet condemned the children's evidence as unreliable. But how unreliable could it have been? It was, after all, enough to jail 10 adults for 150 years when it referred to sexual abuse alone. Long and his colleagues advanced a dozen possible alternate explanations, brainwashing, contamination of evidence being the two favourite. All were based on unsupported assumption. There was hardly a solid fact in the document. And footnote, the section of the Jet report referring to my own evidence manages completely to reverse the facts. I am recorded as disbelieving in the very existence of satanic ritual abuse. Oh, wow. Wow. Long, in writing it, came to the conclusion that ritual abuse did not exist in any shape or form, and that there was nothing in the history of Satanism or the satanic texts he had studied which indicated any linkage between devil worship and child abuse. He did not list what sources he had consulted, but he must have taken a decision not to read any of Aleister Crowley's work, much less the more explicit records of the Guibourg Mass. The Jet delivered its findings to David White in January 1990. The Director of Social Services read the report carefully and decided quickly that it could never be published. It was quite simply stupendously inaccurate, gross libelous, and severely critical of Dawson and Team 4 with no supporting evidence. Wow. He was so concerned about the potential legal action Nottingham County Council could face from Dawson and Team 4. He was so concerned about the potential legal action Nottingham County Council could face from Dawson and Team 4 that he refused to let any of the therapists it criticised view its contents. He had reckoned without those who were determined to eradicate the satanic stories. In spring 1990, the report was widely leaked and used as the basis to discredit Dawson and her colleagues. It was also taken as, quote, proof that satanic ritual abuse was a myth and that in Nottingham, overzealous social workers had conjured up a new witch hunt inspired by evangelical Christians. That there was not a shred of evidence to back up this notion was ignored. Throughout the spring and early summer, Dawson and the Team 4 members demanded to see what had been said about them. They took out a formal complaint against their own department. Finally, David White relented. Dawson and Christine Johnston were to be allowed, under supervision, to consult the Jet report in a locked room. They could make notes, but were not allowed a photocopy. He told the women that they could submit their response and that he would read it. Dawson and Johnston interviewed everyone who gave evidence to the Jet. They were not allowed to reveal to those people what was contained within its blue cardboard covers, but the social workers were determined that their report, at least, should be an accurate record of the interviews. Each was read to and confirmed by its subjects. Any inaccuracies were corrected without question or demur. The therapists submitted their report at the end of the summer. David White waited a month to read it. Then on the 7th of November, he addressed the Council's Social Services Committee. He noted the complete breakdown of any form of working relationship between the senior managers of his department and the Nottingham Police. This meant that children were still at risk. Quote, despite guidance which I've issued to staff, it's said that children are not being adequately protected in the county as a result of the apparent impasse. It's been alleged that a further 17 cases involving 29 children have emerged during the course of the last year, which require further investigation concerning allegations that they may have been ritualistically abused. These revelations are new to me and at the time of preparing this report have yet to be verified. White was clearly torn in two by the arguments still burning between detectives and therapists. A fair man, if indecisive, he chose in the end to place his wish for cordial interagency relations below the need to recognise reality. Quote, although I originally accepted the Joint Inquiry Team's view that ritual abuse was not a feature of the Broxtowe case or its aftermath, and indeed this is the view of the Chief Constable and others given the lack of substantiated corroborated evidence, I do feel that on the basis of the strength of the children's testimony, it would be unwise not to accept the possibility that there were ritualistic elements to this case. My opinion, given all the written material I've reviewed and the comments of the judiciary, is that the disclosures made by the children are unlikely to have been created in their minds by the social workers or foster parents. Cautiously, perhaps, but unmistakably, White had delivered the official verdict on the work of Judith Dawson and Team 4. Ritual abuse in the course of satanic ceremonies was indeed likely to have taken place in Nottingham, and the therapists had been pilloried, spied on, and effectively disbarred from casework for the crime of saying so. Dawson regained much of her former authority and was again allowed to do her job. But the Nottingham case, like McMartin before it, is still written off as evidence that no such phenomenon as satanic ritual abuse exists. How did this come to be? The answer is in a curious and unholy trinity which has dogged the issue from the outset: the church, the press, and the occult. As we shall see, all three have much to answer for. That's the end of chapter 7. We'll continue soon with the chapter 8, Perpetual Holy War. AngelasCaches.org for my work. No apostrophe in Caches is spelled C-A-C-H-E-S. And Angela Power Disney on Facebook or YouTube. And Craig McGowan, thank you for this very hard to come by manuscript.